Hey, everybody, welcome. Good to see everyone in the room. Thanks to everyone on Zoom for being with us. Welcome to another event here today with the Climate Change, Decolonization, and Global Blackness Lab as part of the Entanglement project at FHI. I'm going to introduce our convener, Professor Michaeline Critchlow, in African and African American Studies here at Duke, to introduce our guest.
Thank you all for coming out on what seems like a rather cold morning. Yeah. I sent something to some people up north and I said, dear denizens of colder climes. And they said, well, yeah, it's unusually cold up here today. And so anyway, thank you for listening on Zoom. There are a number of you out there on Zoom as well. Thank you, Michael, the coordinator of our project. Our project is called Climate Change, Decolonization, and Global Blackness. Thanks to Christina Chia, Michael Pasquale, Eric Barstow, and Han Montgomery, Taranji as well, director of FHI, for making this possible. We are very pleased and indeed honored to have Professor Bayo Akomolafe with us today here at the Franklin Humanities Institute. Our project, CCDGP, seeks to foster a more holistic approach to understanding our current planetary condition, understanding the imaginations that attend the prescriptions to resolve it, unpacking the epistemological frameworks in which the discussions, debates, and resolutions have been packaged. Our group poses a very simple question of how did we arrive at this moment of catastrophic disorder? And how might we consider resetting our lives in a way that includes the lives of species, land, objects, humans, more than humans around us? What kinds of struggles are needed or might be needed to struggle for more sensitive, sensible, and a caring approach to dwell in humility without the sorts of violence in which we are enveloped? We know that violence, not just gun violence in its immediate and fatal enactment, and fatal attractions, but the epistemologies and liberal notions of the individual, ideas about rights, self-sovereignties, ideas about justice, dignity, righteousness, feed into the production of all forms of violence as well. We raise these questions from the perspective of the Global South, which in our definition encompasses both the economically dispossessed and racially subjugated persons and places found in the highly industrialized countries of the Global North and the Global South, the former colonies which were once called Third World, or still are called developing nations. Professor Akomolafe's work addresses our project's concerns and goes further, offering us more insightful ways to stimulate our imaginations. He refers to himself as a recovering psychologist, but he brings a good psychological as well approach, at least from my perspective, given my encounters with some of these folks. He brings these to his considerations of the state of the planet and our responses to fix things ourselves and our conditions, many based on these probability models that still allow for pronouncements of certainty that probability models cannot answer. His considerations and writings are wide-ranging and deep. He facilitates a thinking outside the box, seriously. He provides us with the sorts of questions and timely observations that unsettle our imaginations. He beckons us to travel with him, leave aside the certainties of our perspectives, our ways of beholding the world, the planet, and then, almost like magically, on our own volition, we empty our mind pockets and load them up with questions, different perspectives that come out of our dialogue with his writings. our views fall apart or are significantly changed or amended. What can I say? But it's truly a magical encounter. Everything I've read from Professor Akomolafe makes me want to revise a lot of what I've thought and written. So I'm not sure about this recovering psychologist thing. Certainly he seems to have carried the tools from that profession into his current philosophical musings. Professor Akomolafe exposes the tidy assumptions we work with that guide our thinking. He's capable of definitely making us fall apart in a good and generative way. And I think that's his wish. We fall apart and hopefully we reassemble with a different, perhaps even better, but certainly a more poetical, political, and ethical, that is, and provocative grasp of our social individual selves and the places we inhabit, and of course, the other more than humans that we share our lives with, that we depend on in a sort of symbiotic way. We reconstitute ourselves and our elsewheres. He works, in his words, with slushy standpoints, and perhaps we'll explore what this actually means in the seminar that follows his presentation here. But listen to what he says about the Anthropocene. The world is too rich, too promiscuous, too generative to host hope and stability alone. It would seem, and I'm still quoting, that the universe is more prolific at generating loss than it is at keeping things together. In the self-same moment, it manufactures the membrane. It summons the conditions of its decay. And he continues, perhaps in these post-humanist times, we'd have to meander a little, stray a little more, stutter even more, and cultivate the capacities to relinquish the tyranny happily ever after, if only to listen to elsewheres between the lines. His article on Black Lives Matter advances the viewpoint that the BLM might be occupying the same onto-epistemological ground as white lives matter, or even all lives matter for that matter, and therefore subverting the very demands another world that they desire. In other words, BLM furthers perhaps a liberal agenda that might not lead us out of the morass. A seat at the table may not even be desirable. Professor Bayo Akomolafe is a widely celebrated international speaker, a post-humanist thinker, poet, teacher, public intellectual, essayist, and author of 2 books, These Wilds Beyond Our Fences, Letters to My Daughter on Humanity's Search for Home, and We Will Tell Our Own Story, The Lions of Africa Speak. He's the founder also of the Emergence Network and host of the post-activist course festival event, We Will Dance with the Mountains. He currently lectures at Pacifica Graduate Institute of California and sits on the board of many organizations, including Science and Non-Duality and Ancient Futures of Australia. In July 2022, he was appointed the inaugural Global Senior Fellow at UC Berkeley's Othering and Belonging Institute. He also has been fellow for the New Institute in Hamburg, Germany, and visiting critic in residence for the Otis College of Art and Design in Los Angeles. He's also the recipient of an honorary doctorate from the California Institute of Integral Studies, among other recognitions. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bayo Akomolafe, whose presentation is, as you see, Becoming Black on White Syncopation at the End of the World.
Hi, everyone. Just as a, and welcome. Just as a brief introduction to the Entanglement seminars, of which this is a part. The Entanglement seminars, or the project, the Entanglement project, has been addressing the historical, cultural, and political shifts in understanding the entangled concepts of race, climate, and health that underpin any notion of what we might call a solution to contemporary problems. It looks at innovations in learning to live and concepts of political futurity that emerge in literature, philosophy, and the arts. Of course, lack of primary health care made increasingly visible by the pandemic that we have gone through, police violence and mass incarceration, the housing crisis created through evictions, repossessions, catastrophic climate events like Katrina, everyday ecological damage created by massive temperature shifts in previously forested areas, and Black neighborhoods where highways were created, the unequal beneficiaries of infrastructural change, lead-laden water. All these things are, of course, possibly changed on the level of policy, changes in the law, in medical practices, in our understanding of the environment. But when we look to the questions of solutions that are offered by some of these different formulations, the humanities is often largely absent from the table. Not that being present at the table is the only thing we would want. We want to look in these seminars, then in these projects, at questions of what constitutes justice, health, or an ecology in which one can thrive, all of which are primarily philosophical, imaginative, and historically and culturally shaped concepts debated within our fields. We aim to shift the discussion shaping future decision-making, for example, to create robust humanities-inflected vocabularies that allow us to understand, obviously, the correlation between such things as justice and law, medicine and health, infrastructural change, and thriving ecologies. But it is also the case that we want to look at the incommensurabilities between those terms. For example, in the ways in which justice, there can be no justice without law, but equally how there can be no law without some kind of, no ethical law, without some kind of sense of the possibility of justice. So I'm going to stop there and welcome our speaker, and thank you for coming so much.
It's cold. Yeah, I caught myself shivering a bit this morning. I was promised warm sunshine. What happened? Just sudden, just like that. But there's a warmth I feel though, being here. And I thank you for having me, and to the beautiful team that has gathered this and convened this exploration together. Thank you again and again for having and hosting this very, very promiscuous conversation about syncopation. And I'll get into that. But before I do, I'd like to start with a gentle critique of the pedagogical in terms of the ways that we frame these gatherings in terms of cognitive capture, right? So that there's something to gain, something to put on your CV, something to put in your pack and say, I get it now. There's a sense in which I want to play with that and maybe disrupt that there's something to finally get, that there's some kind of conceptual purity or product from these conversations that we can capture and productivize and render into credit or something. And so I hear my sister, Professor Erin Manning, speak about the para-pedagogical, right? That which sidles the lines of the pedagogical, the outside that will not be brought inside, right? And one way I like to radicalize or ritualize this outside that will not be brought inside is to ask the question, what resists capture? Is understanding the sole aim of these conversations? Is there some generativity to confusion and staying with the trouble? So in light of that, I would like everyone to participate with me in an ancient ritual, okay? So if you could rise to your feet, it's so ancient that it is contemporary, like my jet lag. I was just telling Michael, that I've gone full circle. Like to get here, I went through India and then Berlin and then Brazil and then here, right? So my jet lag has just gone, into some zones. It's come all the way around. I'm now in the right zone, but it's heavily pathological at this moment, right? I'd like you to find 2 or 3 other people and give them a hug. And this hug is noticing that we're not going to figure things out, but that's quite all right. Just hug, say welcome. Okay. Thank you. The point is not to arrive at a point. The point is a meandering autistic line that will not be corralled into the gentrification of meaning. The point is fugitive. And so we want to trace here, not to capture, not to draw a full circle around and say, that's it, which is what modernity is good at, drawing full circles, closed loops that capture. I like to start with a story. It's an apocryphal story. It's apocryphal because it cannot be verified if it actually happened, but that's beside the point. This is a story that I got to hear for the first time when I visited Brazil. I think I've been there 6 times. I was taken on a tour through a favela. And I remember a teacher. It was through the favela, there were projects. And one of those projects had teachers doing things, very interesting things with children in a favela. As I was passing through, one teacher grabbed my hand and said, "Look at this doll." And it was a rag doll. It was not very pretty, but it was a doll, black. It was made of some cloth material, some fabric. And she showed me the doll with such excitement. Now, I'm not too fond of dolls, so I politely acknowledged the greatness of the doll and sought to continue on the tour. I said, "Oh, yeah, great." And I was going on, but she held my hand and said, "This doll's name is Abayomi." Now, that froze me in my tracks because, you see, my son's name is Abayomi and my father's name is Abayomi. So it was like calling me into a space of ancestral futurity, if you will, or futural ancestrality. It was like, stay here for a while and consider this conundrum. Abayomi is a Yoruba name. I can't quite tell how it survived and crossed the Atlantic and lives in Brazil right now. But I was told a story about how the rag doll called Abayomi came to be. And this is a story about a woman, her child, a slave ship, and a restless god, and what they gave birth to, a rag doll. It's a very controversial story. There are parts of Brazilian activism that do not accept this story or seek to challenge its telling, which makes it even more interesting to me. I'll tell you the story. It's said that on one of those transatlantic voyages, there was a woman who had a child, right? She had a child on a slave ship. It's unimaginable to think of those kinds of circumstances. And the child was crying, as you would do if you're under those, if you're in that situation. And the child could not be comforted. The child was just yelling and screaming, and the woman did her darndest to help the child, just to calm the child. But nothing was happening, and so she prayed, and she prayed specifically to a god, the trickster god of the Yoruba cosmology called Eshu. Anyone heard of Eshu here? Okay. And she got inspired to do something. So she tore her dress, which is black, and she just braided some kind of a doll out of the dress, out of the shreds. And somehow that kind of gave comfort to the crying child. And then so the rag doll became Abayomi. Abayomi means, it's a long story. Yoruba names are long and fluid and ongoing, right? If I would tell you my full name, wouldn't leave this place, right? That's the full name is Otaobayomi Olorunwoje, which is a story. Yoruba names are actually stories, they're epics. But you see, it's not quite convenient to call someone with an epic, right? So we reduce them to the more intelligible forms of names. Otaobayomi Olorunwoje is the story of abjection and liberation within abjection. If I could reduce it to something more convenient, it would be this, that the devil or the enemy would have defeated me, but God did not allow it. Okay. Another way to interpret the name Abayomi is that they thought they had buried me, but they did not realize that I'm a seed. So it's in a way the upsetting of the enterprise of captivity, that there's something that skizzes the lines of capture, something that the captor could not have anticipated, right? So that's the story of Abayomi, the ragdoll that became a symbol for emancipation and liberation. And there are many groups in Brazil that take that ragdoll as a black fist in white skies, if you will. It's almost like an invitation to consider the para-ontological. I read this interesting story through another story, which is by Professor Femi Yuba, who is a Nigerian playwright. He's 84 years old. I think he's somewhere in the United States right now. He's done some work with Edward Glisson, Wale Soyinka, and other Black authors. He wrote a play called The Gulf in 1989. I think it was published in 1991. I've been trying to get my hands on a copy of this, but I haven't been able to. So if anyone has a copy, I'm willing to buy it for $1 million. The story is really a story of the crossroads. In The Gulf, Femi Yuba tells a story that I think has become sublimated into the larger culture. It's no longer Femi Yuba's story. It's now almost like a Yoruba myth. And it tells a story of, in the iteration that I'm working with, and which is part of my next book called An Ocean of Milk. It's the story of how the god of iron and the god of metal and the god of victory, whose name is Ogun, mounted an insurgency against the slavers. His work was to try to chase them away, to win and to push away those slavers and to end slavery once and for all. And so he rushed with his army to the beach to try to do that, but was intercepted by Eshu, the trickster. And when the trickster showed up, he told his brother, the Orisha, called Ogun, he said, why don't we just give this some time? You see, let's just take a breather, have some coffee, maybe gather in a conference. debate this, talk about this, think about this a little bit more, and then we can proceed on this journey, insurgency. His brother conceded, and while the brother was resting, Issue gave him the most intoxicating of wines, which is called palm wine. Anybody had palm wine here? Yes, you looked up because you know what that's about. Palm wine. My father used to have some, and I used to take a sip. It's very tough stuff, right? And Ogun went to sleep, and his army went to sleep as well. And Issue crept into the slave ship, not stopping it from happening, not stopping slavery from happening, but he crept into the cracks of the slave ship and proceeded to travel with the slaves across the Atlantic Ocean. I found it very difficult to accept that story because I wanted to, in my younger academic ponderings and days, I wrote a book with Molefi Asante, who is considered a father of Afrocentrism, when I was a postgraduate exploring a PhD. And I encountered this story, and I was angry with the story because I felt our gods could have done something more definitive. How about just stop the whole thing from happening, stopping oppression? But Issue is the, as I write here, the hidden tension, right? The reminder that captivity is never complete, right? Capture is never total or totalizing, right? I write that Issue is the hidden tension, the site of possibility, the skizzing line that upsets the loop, right? Fred Moten might call that the break or the cut, and I often speak about that as the crack. Zizek might think about it as the event. I don't know. But Issue disrupts the coloniality and the coherence of captivity of the slave ship, right? In a sense, he refused that the slave ship was just a vessel or an instrument of captivity and slavery. It was now carrying a god across the Atlantic, creolizing the future. It's like a wooden vessel or a wooden womb that was wanting to birth something else, right? And Issue teaches, like every trickster trope, teaches us never to trust in completeness, right? To notice the partiality of how things come to emerge together with other things in the world, right? I write here that Issue is the disarchitecture of the slave ship. I've often thought in my mind that as those slavers were counting, like how many on board? 72, 73, 110, 101, 101, 101. And they close the gates and they're about to set sail. But there's 102nd person that was lurking, a stowaway epistemology, something that could not be counted, something beyond the economies of credit and surplus value, a debt, a glitch of some kind that meant the total, the whole, was never whole. Are you still following me? Are you sufficiently confused? I start with the slave ship, and it's often difficult for people to hear. People urge me sometimes to leave this vessel alone because we've progressed beyond slave ships. I actually think it's a very, very potent political constituent of our time, that the slave ship never really disappeared. But it does seem strange to begin with considerations of this architecture, especially when we're in the midst of so much trouble. There's Gaza, there's climate change, police brutality, racialization. Think of all the things you would like to get rid of. Just have that come to your mind in a sentence or a phrase. Could someone shout out what just came into your mind? Let me hear it. Just say it out. You don't need to shout out. We're being polite people here. Oh, okay. even though I'm very suspicious of politeness. Yes. Genocide. Yes. Thank you. Anyone else? Hate. Thank you. What else? Hunger. Is there hunger? I said hunger because I'm actually feeling hungry right now. Michael, after this is done, I'm a diva. I need some stuff. Okay, what else? What else is coming to your mind? Sir? Oppression. Survival as something you want to get rid of, or the lack of survival? Yes, the lack of survival. What else? What else? What keeps you up at night? Sir? Surveillance. Ooh, yes, that's another keynote. AI, deep fakes, the indexing, categorizing, archiving processes of white modernity. There's a lot going on there. Yes, what else? One more. And this one wins a prize of $10,000 from Michael. Sir? Capital. So, yeah. Get your money, brother. Capital has more mobility these days, right? And so these troubles, you would think, let's take this head on and let's address these crises instead of talking about slave ships. But as I write here, the choreographies and the cartographies of the slave ship in the co-production of Black abjection cannot be read apart from the time-spilling operations of liberalism in its brutal sustenance of the Anthropocene, which is just a roundabout way of saying to read the slave ship is to read the troubles of today, right? The Anthropocene cannot be read apart from the journeys of the slave ship, right? Racialization as a co-production of climate ontologies, of emergency and justice. Racialization is not a thing apart. How bodies were racialized. I'm going to use the phrase of Hortense Spiller's, the hieroglyphics of the flesh, right? How bodies were unspooled and violently beaten into the abjection of the flesh cannot be read apart from the troubles we face today as a species, right? In fact, I would go so far as to say the slave ship is a very generative way of thinking about, a modality for thinking about these issues. Centrally, the ideology and the politics of the individual, which is what I think white modernity is prolific at producing. White modernity is not white people, okay? Remember James Baldwin, that dude, right? If you think you're white, there's no hope, right? So whiteness is not white people. Whiteness is a way of producing the conditions for the flatness of the individual. Whiteness is neurotypicality. Whiteness is dissociation. It's a tendency within a world-producing machine to produce bodies in particular ways. What we're saying here is that in order to produce specific bodies and specific conditions and specific territories, you need raw materials. Black bodies were those materials. The slave ship is more important, or important in more ways than what it says about the environmental impacts of the Middle Passage. So I'm not saying here that we merely consider the carbon emissions of those millions of journeys across the Atlantic. That's not the consideration here. I'm speaking about how those movements were in service of creating the liberal humanist subject, right? The liberal humanist subject is the work of whiteness, is the work of those slave ships, okay? So let's take it from there. I was in Bahia recently. Bahia is in Salvador. filming a documentary with my brothers, Orland Bishop and Resma Menakem, called Three Black Men, it's just a multi-continental exploration of Blackness as something that traverses or breaks away from the lines of its origins. We often think about Blackness in terms of the origins of violence. It's violent cooptation within whiteness, but there's a different kind of Blackness. And so we're telling the stories in the tradition of the griot about this other Blackness, this space of radical hospitality, but I digress. In fact, this whole vocation is a digression of some sort. So we're there in Bahia after leaving LA, and we're going to Ghana in December to the castle, the point of no return, and we're going to have some time there together. While we were walking about, I saw this thing. Does anyone know what this is? No, I asked because I don't know as well. I don't know what this is, but I saw at this shore this very, very strange thing. And Bahia is notorious for being the first slave market. This is in the 16th century. The slave market formed around 1558, and it was the largest. Bahia was once, it was the first capital of Brazil, right? And millions of people passed through Brazil. Of course, the most popular is Cais do Valongo in Rio de Janeiro, but Bahia was the first. It got there first. It's the OG, if you will. And I saw this thing and I could not but think about, like, this is the vestigial organ of a slave ship of some kind, or some mechanism for holding those ships at bay, right? Which gave me some reinforcement for some ideas I've been exploring, that the slave ship never really disappeared. It just vomited its entrails to the shore, or rather it became the shore. The slave ship became the shore. It didn't disappear. Clotilda is not the last slave ship. We're still in the slave ship. It's my way of inviting us to notice that disembarkation never happened. We never got off the slave ship. Black bodies, white bodies, all kinds of bodies. We are within the practices of the slave ship, because the slave ship is not just a wooden vessel. It's a practice of instrumentalization. Those practices live on in the shore. I write that the ship's entrails, instrumental to the blows that unspooled bodies into wounded flesh, hieroglyphics of the flesh, are practices of appropriation. The slave ship's task was to sell a product, the liberal human subject, right? To make credit, raw materials are needed, factors of production. Black bodies are how the sensorium of magisterial independence is produced. There are stories of, and I just want to take several steps to the left or to the right, to the side, just to invite us to think about how the liberal humanist subject is subsidized by what is invisibilized, right? That Black bodies, for instance, in Brazil, were the first public latrine system. Rio de Janeiro had aspirations to be like Paris. They just didn't have the resources to get there at first. And so one mayor, I forget his name now, of Paris, of Rio de Janeiro, appropriated or co-opted or enlisted Black bodies to be the first toilet system for the city. How did this happen? Defecatory material. I'm just going to be on my unpolite self and say shit. Was transferred across distances by Black bodies. And they were so marked by this exercise in keeping the sanity and the cleanliness of the city. They were so marked by it, by that stripes started to appear on their bodies, of those Black bodies. So there was a nickname for those Black bodies, tigres, which is tigers. So Black bodies subsidized progress. The idea of the surface being a clean break from the wildness of the past, the liberal humanist subject, independent of his own feces, was subsidized by these minoritarian gestures beneath the surface, if you will. And that is how the colonial human started to take root. This is what Sylvia Winters speaks about as the man, right? The human is not the thing. It's not the anthropomorphical shapes that we're used to. The human is a territory. The human is a field of gestures, already including the more than human, right? Feces, wood, slave ships, cogs, and wheels. All of this makes up the human. So my story here is really about embarkation. A lot of our activism is premised on the idea or the promise of disembarkation, that by and by we can get off. We can produce the liberal humanist subject. We can cut off from the links that tether us to the material world, and we can be free, right? This is disembarkation. Embarkation is a Black poetic, is the poetics of migrancy, is the poetics of being carried away. It's the idea that we never got off, we're still on, and we have to stay with the trouble of our concatenation, imbrications, and entanglements within troubling architectures. This is a different framework, but an invitation to be within, as Eshu took the challenge, right? Eshu did not try to defeat, Eshu went within to uncurl the traps of modernity from within. Embarkation is the ongoing co-production of credit, the marketing of the liberal humanist subject, as well as the abjection of flesh. But it's not just that. It is the poetics of migrant dust, errant bodies, bacchanal displacements. I borrowed that from Earl Lovelace. Does anyone know Earl Lovelace here? Trini novelist who writes about bacchanal aesthetics, right? The playfulness of staying within troubling dimensions. But I digress again. And embarkation is about destabilizing the dense milieus that destabilize subjectivity as belonging to the subject, right? It favors impermanent molecular movements. I'm speaking about what the Yoruba people call ashe. Has anyone heard that phrase or that word before? Ashe. It's getting as popular as namaste. But not quite, but everyone says it these days, you know, ashe, ashe. Ashe is, I'll be so rude to offer some kind of a conceptualization. Ashe is agency, right? So when the Yoruba people think about Eshu as the man of the crossroads who holds Ashe, they're trying to say that Ashe is capacity to be in response with. It's the capacity to do. It's not owned by anyone per se, but it is how the world is constantly undoing and doing itself. It's the vibrancy, the animacy of all things that precedes the thinginess of things, right? It's the relationality and the conditions of being and becoming. It's affectivity. I prefer affectivity to agency. Agency is more, I don't know, it's more convenient. I like what affectivity does. It's like the intensity in a room, what is made available, what is impossible, but also what is possible, what is illegible, but also what is legible, right? Ashe is embarkation. Ashe is a world that is troublingly alive, too promiscuous to fix into the left or the right or our political ideologies of choice, a world that is spilling and is constantly touching itself orgasmically, a world that is not still, right? It is within this poetics that I meet the idea of becoming Black, and more troublingly, just as well, of white syncopation. And what I mean by that, and basically what I'm trying to story here is an invitation to become lost. My people say, in order to find your way, you must become lost. White modernity is the pathology of being found, right? We're so situated. We're so identified. Our politics looks like, our politics takes for granted our foundness. And so there's nothing else to do. We're stuck, right? Our politics is about, for instance, saving the minority. And I often ask, saving the minority into what? I've often expressed this as using the heuristic of the slave ship. It's almost like we're bringing Black bodies from the hull of the slave ship to the upper deck. And that's what justice is. But we're still on the damn slave ship, right? Embarkation does not begin with a subject. This is still tracing out something that goes beyond the liberal human subject. And I want to remind us here that the slave ship, like my dear sister Marisol de la Cadena and Arturo Escobar in conversation, we have these conspiratorial conversations. Marisol said, Bayo, I think the first instrument of capture wasn't the slave ship, it was the human, right? Bodies were imported into the human, into liberalism, into the liberal humanist subject, the dissociated self. That's what white modernity's project and product is, right? And we're disrupting that with this poetics of embarkation. It doesn't begin with a subject, it's the centering of human subjects. It's not a getting on the boat, right? It's not there's no getting on the boat. The conditions of enslavement precede getting on the boat, right? It is pre-individual. I'm using terms from Gilbert Simondon. Anyone know Gilbert Simondon, right? It is pre-individual. It is about intensities and thresholds that exceed the I that moves, right? Our politics is so fixated on the I, right? I was thinking about the ways that solidarity is framed today in terms of the wars in the Middle East, right? There's a sense in which getting involved or taking a stand only reinforces liberalist ethics, the idea that we are outside of the situation and then we decide to get involved. There's no getting involved in a world that is entangled. We're already complicit. So that in a sense, there's an ableism to taking a stand, I dare say. How many of you have phones here? Could you just... if I told you that your phones were dependent on the misery of Congolese children who have to mine cobalt, when do you decide to get involved, right? Is there a getting involved that does not already obscure the way that you are within networks of suffering, right? How many of you like donuts? Okay, first question to the question of the Congolese mining of cobalt. How many of you, because of that information I've just dropped, and I'm sure you're pretty aware of it already, will stop using your phones? Okay, no one. So we're quite willing to live in a world that is troubling. And donuts? Turns out that donuts are connected with the decimation of Sumatran tigers and orangutans. How? Those sweet, wonderful delicacies, how are they connected with the decimation of tigers? You see, to fry your donut, you need oil. And oil is produced by clearings and, clearing forests and all that. And to do that, you have to take into consideration those other species that depend on those trees and those ecologies. So to get your oil that makes your donut and that makes you so happy, a tiger has to die. Now, who here is going to stop taking donuts? You stop. Yeah, but stopping, even if you're to stop doing it, the ontological space created isn't one of purity, right? You just enter into new fields of entanglement. It's like that brother that told me that, Bayo, I'm going to encourage people to stop being on Facebook and get into their backyards and do permaculture. And I was like, wonderful, amazing idea. Tell me how you want to do it. He said, I've already set up a Facebook group. And yeah. So you get the point. Liberalism is the afterlife of the slave ship. And I know there are many, it's a conceptually contested thing, but I'm drawing the genealogies of what I refer to as liberalism from John Locke and those philosophers and its iterations today. Neoliberalism is basically the idea that we're free, unencumbered, untethered. It informs our politics today. In fact, it's everything after August 6, 1945 has been that's Hiroshima, and Nagasaki 3 days later, has been a scaffolding of this universalist and universalizing consensus led by the US in its imperialism. A liberalist world order where everyone is free. Of course, freedom comes with a price. Cold War and the proliferation of human legacy projects, like building a monolith to the idea of our humanity, our untethered humanity, with the establishment of the UN, the World Health Organization. These were all things that happened post-Hiroshima, right? In the 1940s and the 50s, the establishment of the IMF and all these institutions that still live today, where the scaffolding for the human, the monolith, the anthropos, and this is the afterlife of the slave ship, right? And it's how we think today. It's how we organize activism. It's what we look forward to when we think about a world that works, right? It's what the US markets to the global South. You can have freedom. What does freedom look like? McDonald's. You can have your own McDonald's. You can have your own Walmart. You can have your own parking lot. You can have your own smooth highways. Freedom. Even justice is the coherence of this world order. You might think of justice as this idealized coming to realization of the best forms of sociality, but justice is material. It's materially embedded in our relationships. There's no transcendent notion of justice. It is embedded in our networks, how we eat, how we are eaten by what we eat, the furniture around us, the intensities, and what we are co-producing is the intelligibility of the public order. My brother said surveillance. There's a sense in which justice demands surveillance. It demands this frontal posture that you have to show up in order to be set aright. You have to be seen. It's a politics of recognizability and visibility, right? There's no justice if you don't show up. But to show up is to risk surveillance. And to risk surveillance is to risk being captured. And captivity is being archived. It's being put in the family away. It's being rendered useful. And there's nothing as terrifying as being useful. even the way we think about blackness. Blackness, the eternal site of contestation, right? Blackness is usually framed as the other of whiteness, which is hilarious. It's this contestation of lines. You know, it's a framework of the majoritarian and the minoritarian, where the minoritarian is constantly pining for a seat at the table, right? And this is the architecture of justice, which only understands itself in terms of inclusivity. So come up to the upper deck, come and get a seat at a table. And in doing this dynamic, this algorithm of relations only serves to preserve the very instrumentality of the dissociated self, right? It's like, I want to be seen. Give me a seat at the table. Of course, this is why Edouard Glissant spoke about the right to opacity. And this is why Deleuze was always about becoming monster, right? There's a sense in which our frameworks, even blackness as an identitarian concept, leaves us wanting for something else, right? It's the reification of the minoritarian. And I write here that attempts to end white supremacy reinscribe the burdens and legacies of the individual. It's what happened, it's happening, especially on the left, the political left. I've seen a Black woman insist that a white woman apologize for her privilege. And the white woman cried and apologized for her privilege. And I said to myself, this entire scenario is a reinforcement of privilege, of that same privilege that the white woman has just apologized for. Because privilege can not only be considered in terms of its access to it, but in terms of being the only imaginary of how power allocates itself, right? If that's the only imaginary at work, then even if I don't have it, it's like the way I speak about Nigeria. Nigeria is the blackest nation on earth. 200 million Black people, and it's a very white country. How is it white? Because its imaginary is white. Its politics is white. It wants to be, if you fly with Nigerians and enter into Lagos, how many of you have been to Lagos? No. Are you from Nigeria? Thank you for being here. And you, my sister? Ghana. Okay, we'll have a conversation later about who has the best jollof rice. It's your brother who has the best jollof rice? Of course. Yeah. Sorry, I'm a supremacist that way. When you fly into Nigeria, you get a sense of the inbuilt neurotypicality of self-hatred that manifests itself in terms of Nigerians hissing that they're landing in airports that don't work as well as those ones that work in London or New York. So you hear people say, oh, we're here again. Why can't we be like New York or London? You see, this is what some scholars call the catch-up imperative, right? We're doing our very best to look like y'all. And so that's the imaginary. Privilege is not just in terms of access. Privilege is in terms of, also works even with those that don't have access to it. Part of its architecture is in reinforcing a monolith of imagination, that this is the only way to consider sociality or power or access. And so we often think about whiteness as an evil thing, something to take down, something to destroy. And my soft argument here is that's a reinforcement of whiteness, right? To think of whiteness as an evil, and I know many scholars have had conversations with me about this, the thing to do is to destroy whiteness. But if we think about whiteness as something transcendent, something outside of relations, something more than material, something transcendent, then we risk falling into the trap of an evil versus good kind of narrative, where the other side wins by vanquishing the other, right? And in a game of sides, the greatest loss is the other side. Whiteness is not white people. Whiteness is not an evil. That's a conversation stopper. Whiteness is how bodies are arranged in racialized hierarchies of access. And we're all part of this. We're all complicit. We're all entangled with its tentacularities. And that's why I write that how we respond to the crisis is the crisis. If we stop with a politics of defeat or a politics of victory, we reenact Ogun's mistake, which was to vanquish the other. Eshu did something different there, right? I'm calling back to that story, right? We need something that escapes the appellatory appropriation and violence of Blackness, right? I'm speaking about Nahum Chandler, Fred Moulton, Saidiya Hartman, the para-ontological, the crustacean. And this is what my sisters were saying just a while ago about the inadequacy of solutions. I might as well add the inadequacy of justice. Because justice will give you a seat at the table, but it will not allow you out of the house. It will not allow you to stray from its epistle or onto epistemologies, its morality, its containment. We need something that sidles the logic of credit and surplus value. I'm speaking about the ways that bodies, minoritarian bodies, are part of this production of the liberal humanist subject in their objectivity. And they're put in the family way, in this loop, right? Continually producing credit so that the product can shine, which is exemplified by the white male, right? More popularly. We need autistic perception, ways of looking away at. I call it looking away at because I think clarity is getting in the way of our seeing stuff. The precision of modernity is beguiling. Okay? There's a sense in which we lose sight of what the world is doing because we're paying too much attention. I know that's ironic, but when you focus, when you focus so astutely on something, there is the loss of panoramic vastness, if you will. And so clarity is a political commitment, and our attempts to find the facts, and I like what Saidiya Hartman writes about facts as the state's preferred fiction, right? But when you focus, there's something that's lost, and we're losing sight of a world that is still coming together autistically. This is what Erin Manning refers to as autistic perception. That perception is not a representation of the outside world. It is co-participation in a world that is still coming together. So we need new peripheral visions that take in the effulgence, the emergence of a world that is open-ended. I'll skip this for now. And this, there's a lot to say about this, but I'll skip this. And just get to what I mean by white syncopation. Someone told me, why all this talk about whiteness? We're centralizing whiteness by talking about it. Shouldn't we just focus on the alternatives? And a response was by speaking about whiteness isn't necessarily centralizing whiteness. Whiteness is a fabric of co-sensing. It's a perceptual order. It's omelas in Ursula Le Guin's The Ones That Walk Away from Omelas. It's how bodies are organized, like I've said. But it is very, very material, and it can be destabilized. So white syncopation refers to the destabilizing forces and events that disrupt the dominant ontology of whiteness, of the citizen, of liberalism and anthropocentrism, which seeks to maintain the coherence of the autonomous human subject. The syncopation, and who here is familiar with the musical term of syncopation, right? So I don't need to explain that. You understand the kick drum and the hi-hat and the minor beat and the upbeat and the downbeat. So you know the emphasis on the upbeat produces danceability and rhythm, right? It is my sense that whiteness is not stable. It is being curdled like an ocean of milk. I've just given you the thesis of my next book, right? It's becoming curdled. It's subject to decay, right? And destabilization. Blackness, not the big B blackness. I like to make distinction between the big B blackness that is committed to being seen and the small b blackness that is counterhegemonic and post-humanist, like an animist wind that is blowing and taxing the borders of our skins and bodies and producing something that is not quite nameable. Blackness is that counter-hegemonic force that is white syncopation, right? It's rupture. It names the moments of rupture where the stability and presumed universality, this is what is often mistaken. When people speak about white supremacy, there's almost a capitulation to its universality, right? I welcome all the glitches and phone calls as syncopating forces as well. Its presumed universality is troubled by the syncopated rhythms of emergent relationality and solidarities and indeterminacy, all the ways that we are proving to be. My sister said something a while ago, that, what did you say about the world becoming stranger or something like that? You started by, she said something about the strangeness. Yes. Yes. Strange things are happening. Strange things happening feels like white syncopation. All the ways we're losing steam, all the ways things are becoming incoherent, all the ways we're losing our keys, and all the ways that things are not adding up with the math and the logic with which they added up before, right? It's not just pandemics. It's many other things that are cyclical, eco-corporeal, political, mythopoetic, and sexual. This is not encyclopedic. These are just the ways that it is becoming impossible for white modernity to uphold the paradigm of the individual. It's flailing and sweating under the ontological weight of our individuality, right? Its knees buckling. It cannot hold this weight any longer. And mind you, this weight is the Anthropocene. This weight is climate anxiety. This weight is climate chaos. It is impossible to read these racialized concepts away from how the world is wilting under the weight of the liberal humanist subject, right? I'm just going to discuss one. I can share these slides later, but the cyclical. My dear sister, Sherry Mitchell, spoke recently about all the ways we're beginning to feel the grief of whales, right? That could it just be that when we stop our cars in the middle of the road and pull up to the side and we cannot account for a wave of grief or feeling we've just felt, maybe it's not to be traced along the developmental tracks of the human, right? In the ways that American psychotherapy traditionally does its work. Like something must happen to you when you were a child, right? It's that developmental track, that linearity is preserved. But how are we beginning to sense, and I'm speaking in the cadence of Teresa Brennan, the transference of affect? How are we picking up on the grief of multi-species saloons and animacies? How are we being pierced? How are we already getting involved? How are we sensing the tears of a mother in Gaza? How are we being imbricated in this, right? So the immunity and imperviousness and gilded interiority of the humanist subject is being haunted by these syncopating flows. That's just one way in which whiteness is losing its steam. Again, whiteness, not white people. It captured white people as it captured Black people. It's a very persistent habit to associate whiteness with white people, even though it took white people as its emojis, right? And placed them atop a pyramid. But to be on top of a pyramid is to be in a very, very lonely place. And so whiteness is spilling. Whiteness is being curdled. And this curdling is a becoming Black. When people hear me speak about becoming Black, they imagine I'm speaking about taking on Black skin. No, that would be a becoming Black with a big B, which is not exactly what I would speak about, or this is not what I'm speaking about. I'm speaking about all the ways we are sensing through the world that exceeds the liberalism of our times, all the ways we are becoming fugitive, all the ways the plantation and its labors cannot hold our politics, and all the ways in a promissory note we are being invited to be part of a third way. And by third way, I'm not talking about the independents. I'm not talking about a politics that is not democratic or Republican. I'm speaking about issue. I'm speaking about the transversal line that crosses out the binary. I'm thinking about something that is still being made, because the left and the right are still part of the co-production of dissociation. They are unable to hold the weight and the aspirations of our time. We need a different politics. And that politics will dance along the lines of becoming monster, becoming Black, becoming syncopated. And that's what dancing is, isn't it? Syncopation. White syncopation destabilizes the assumed continuity of the autonomous self. In the gaps and fissures, there is potential for ontological and sensorial apostasy, right? I never speak about justice, which is not to pathologize justice or to say those who are working towards justice are doing the wrong thing. I don't know how to think in terms of wrong or right, but I'm leaning into post-humanist futures that are illegible, non-legible futures that are not available for our parsing yet. And this is surprising and beautiful for me to contemplate, because the futures we can articulate now may just be a repetition of what we already know. I'm very intrigued about how the familiar repeats itself and then postures itself as newness, right? So I'm really into the illegibility of the future beyond justice. And this is why I speak about apostasy or ontological mutiny, right? White syncopation creatively enables epistemological mutiny against dominant modes and images of thought and being. Rather than reform or inclusion, it allows for radical hybridity and boundary transgression. I'm very intrigued by all the ways that we are becoming other, or becoming more and more ourselves, not in some humanist utopian process, but in terms of all the things we cannot articulate. This break from continuity engenders new relationalities, unexpected solidarities, and lines of flight, Deleuze and his schizoanalysis. It opens possibilities for post-humanist embodiment and subjectivity outside the grammar of man. The promise is not rational progress or resolution, but unpredictable becomings. And I'd like to end with this. This politics, this becoming other, this becoming monstrous, this becoming Black, where Blackness is the disarchitecture of the anthropos, where Blackness is the skizzing line that breaks away from this, from the territoriality of the slave ship, where Blackness is not just the identitarian passenger concept to whiteness, but the emergence, the open-ended experimentation of a world in its promiscuous becoming. I'd like to end with this account of my wife, and I just skipped considerations of the minor gesture and the major gesture because of time and because of my tummy is making some noises. But we live in India, in Chennai, and my son is autistic, as I am, but in those old categories of hierarchy making in terms of intensity, you would say that I'm mild and my son is more intense. Around the time he was 3 or 4 years old, we were walking in a shopping mall in Chennai. And India is increasingly a collection of shopping malls and parking lots. This huge one, and we're doing our capitalist business, buying stuff. Like everyone else, when my son, something affected him and he was overcome by emotion and he could not hold himself. The expectation that we hold ourselves is neurotypicality, right? My son was intelligently in touch with something else that I could not sense. But I was embarrassed, you see, because when he started making noise and flailing and thrashing on the ground, I wasn't sure what to do. And all my degrees weren't helpful at that time. And I was failing to be a good father. No, I don't want to say good. I was failing to show up in the ways that he needed me to show up. In the words of Orland Bishop, I was gentrifying him. I was dragging him into my sanities. Because I promised him cookies. I did everything I could just for him to be quiet. Like, just let's get out of here first. But nothing of that sort was happening. And then my wife, who should have been invited here instead of me, who is a lot wiser than I would ever be, who slaps me upside the head when I think of myself as having arrived. She walked up to me and said, walk away, just walk away and let me deal with this. And then she proceeded to crawl up to him on the floor and lie down next to him. She did not say a word. She did not encourage hope. She did not try to encourage him or say everything will be fine. She did not say, what's wrong? Let me fix it. She just stayed by his side in radical accompaniment, the same way that the French visionary Fernand Deligny accompanied those children, right? In the south of France, and actually encouraged everyone in the camp that was in support of these autistic children to lose their language. No one was allowed to speak, right? They wanted to be with the children, to come behind language and sense the world differently. And that was what my wife did. She activated the politics of accompaniment, of becoming Black, of staying with the trouble. It didn't fix my son. It didn't immediately magically cure him. It wasn't a cure she was looking for. She was looking for some kind of strange solidarity, an odd flesh, a kinship, almost like Eshu traveling with the slave ships. She entered into the hull of the ship and stayed in those cracks. By and by, they got up, but I'll never forget those moments of watching them and noticing that this is the politics we need today to address Gaza, to address climate emergencies, to address police brutality, not as an elixir, but as a call to the radical hospitality of co-experimentation beyond the human. Thank you.
Thanks for that really rich presentation. I've been working on the arboreal lately and couldn't help thinking about trees in relation to some of what you were doing. So at one point you said that the slave ship wasn't just a wooden vessel.
Yes.
And yeah, it wasn't just a wooden vessel. There's a lot of deforestation that goes with building those trees. And then when you began to talk about embarkment, I started to think about the etymology of that word. as bark, bark as a ship, and think that in fact the forests that were destroyed to make those ships were in their own way a kind of pre-individual, pre-barkment, perhaps, that you might consider. So I just offer that as a kind of friendly amendment or addition, another entanglement to think about. And I know I was happy when you talked about the deforestation produced by oil. So anyway, I think there's some interesting, I think the wooden ship was a little bit black boxed in a sense and not opened up. And I think if we move back to that, I think we could find some other productive connections. So, thank you.
That is so generative for me. And Deleuze, of course, worked with rhizomes and the rhizomatic and the mycorrhizal and the arboreal. It's a very generative way to think about. In fact, I've actually commissioned there's a brother that I work with, John Marrow, he's an artist, and I commissioned him to do paintings of slave ships becoming some kind of queer assemblages where they sprout butterfly wings or they become trees. And I'm actually also writing a novel right now of a Brazilian journalist becoming arboreal. Right, she literally becomes wood, and this is because she meets the trickster. And I'm not going to tell you the end because I want you to buy the novel. But it's a very generative concept, and thank you for reading that diffractively through this. Thank you, thank you.
I'll ask a question from online. I'll fold them in actually. There's two. One person was asking who the artist that you used in your title slide in the background is. And I'll just ask this other one as well. I'm a psychotherapist. I work with whiteness, white supremacy within people's lived experiences. What do you see as the role of the therapist in every sense of that word in this work?
Oh boy. Okay. These are called wonder lines, and they were produced by the autistic children in Delini's camp. Fernand Delini is a very strong inspiration for me. I wouldn't get into the story of it, but these are attempts to accompany and be with those children instead of rehabilitating them. And they're very, very wonderful stories that were told about these wonder lines, Lynn there, and how they resituated a different kind of politics. So it's not Fernand Delini, it's the autistic children in his camp. And I mean, the collaborators who accompany the children, with these wonder lines, yes. And you can find this in the Arachnidian, I think, Delini's work. Therapy. My sister, Erin Manning, no, it wasn't Erin Manning, it was another friend of mine, Wendy Holloway. She's a professor emeritus of psychology who says that psychology is the policeman of capitalism. And in that sense, therapy can be how bodies are manufactured and stabilized within the perceptual sensorial order of the liberal, right? This is not to say that there aren't situated needs for healing, but I'm just going to borrow a thread or two from Deleuze and Guattari, that sometimes the couch gets in the way. Of course, you know what I mean by the couch. Sometimes healing can be a capitulation to containment, right? The history of trauma, for instance, trauma is not just a clinical concept. Trauma is a political concept. It's some kind of political containment that accepts the properness of certain kinds of bodies and what is external to those bodies. So it's an ideology, it's a theology, trauma, if you will. So what we do in popular or classically idealized therapeutic alliances and contexts might look like the reinstatement of a perceptual order. Erin Manning says, along with Brian Masumi, whiteness polices cracks. everywhere there's an eruption of some kind, whiteness is the attempt to smoothen things over, to get back to normal, right? And sometimes the therapeutic context is enlisted in that vocation, which is the reason why Guattari would speak about schizoanalysis. You know, to wander away from the couch might be the kind of productive thing to do today. So in my work, I conceptualize the theory of ab therapy. Ab therapy means away from therapy, but that's another keynote. Yeah.
I think we'll stop here for
Okay.
today. Thank you, Bayo Akomolafe, so much for being with us.